Last week we talked some about the Old Testament, sort of an introduction to the Old Testament. Now, most Christians use the Old Testament very sparingly. They use it only for things like the 23rd Psalm, Noah and the Ark, the Ten Commandments, the Psalms, and maybe a few passages from Isaiah around Christmas time. But there are some very disturbing things in the Old Testament. Now, if you read the Gospels and look at the things Jesus said and taught, you'll get one picture of God and how God works. If you read the Old Testament, you'll get another picture of things. And many times Christians minimize this and even try to say it's not so. But it is in fact true. In fact, it's so true that we really have to find a way to deal with it. The New Testament and the Old Testament are completely different. Now, in the book of Genesis, we meet a man named Abraham. And we're told later on that God commands Abraham to offer his young son Isaac as a sacrifice. So Abraham takes Isaac and some servants and sets off to where God told him to go. When they get near there, Abraham tells the servants, "You stay here, and Isaac and I are going to go up and offer the sacrifice." So when they get there, Abraham builds a pile of wood to burn the sacrifice on. Then he ties Isaac up. He lays Isaac on top of the wood, draws his knife, and he's just about to slit Isaac's throat when God tells him not to. It was just a test. God was just testing Abraham, seeing if he would have done it. Have you ever really sit down and thought about that scene? What if you had been Isaac? And you're walking along with your daddy, and all of a sudden you realize that you are the sacrifice. What in the world would you have thought? Your father's going to kill you. And then when Abraham goes to grab, what do you think Isaac did? Do you think Isaac just said, "Oh yes, Father, let me get up on the wood and be the sacrifice"? No. Imagine the screaming, the begging, the crying, the struggling. How Abraham had to overpower him, hit him and knock him and beat him until he could get him tied up. And then throw him up on top of that wood, and Isaac just blabbering and screaming and begging and crying. Have you ever thought about it in those terms? What kind of father could do that? And even though Abraham didn't end up killing him, if your father had done that to you, would you ever have been able to be near him again in your life? No. You'd never gotten over that. Nobody would have. But yet that's what we're told. We heard as our Old Testament reading a scene with a man named Lot. Now Lot is not one of the forefathers in the Old Testament, but he is one of the major characters there. He's living in Sodom. And two people come, and they're angels, but Lot doesn't know this. But they're going to spend the night just outside. Well, you know, I wouldn't spend the night outside in Shelby. And I sure wouldn't have done it in Sodom 3,000 years ago. So Lot, knew it wasn't safe. So he said, come to my house and spend the night. So they did. And later on that night, some people come to the house, want Lot to send these two men out there so that they can rape them. And Lot says, no, please don't rape them. Please don't do this to them. I've got two young virgin daughters in here. They've never been with a man before. I'll send them out and you do whatever you want to with them. Can you even believe something like that? It's unimaginable. In the book of Joshua, is the account of the fall of the city of Jericho. You might remember that from Sunday school as a child, how they blew trumpets and marched around and the walls came tumbling down. I can remember there used to be a song, and the walls came tumbling down, that they used to sing in Sunday school, about that. Well, they didn't tell the 5-year-olds in Sunday school the rest of the story, so here it is. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox, sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. So they went in there and they killed everything. Men, women, children, even the animals. Why'd they do that? Because God told them to. In the book of Deuteronomy, God is telling the people what to do about the people already living in the promised land once they get there. Here's what God says. But in the cities of these people, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive. Nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them. Here God is telling them to destroy everything that breathes. Men, women, children, even babies. Oh, but no. They wouldn't kill babies. No, you got that wrong. No. Well, listen to this from the book of 1 Samuel. God is mad at a group of people called the Amaleks. And here's what it says. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them. Kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So God says, go in there and kill the babies. Kill the 6-month-old. Kill the 1-year-old. In the book of Genesis, a man named Judah had some sons. It says that the first son displeased God, so God killed him. The second displeased God, so God killed him. In the book of Exodus, when Moses is trying to get the Egyptians to let the Hebrews leave, God ends up sending plagues on the Egyptians. You know why? Well, we're told why. Because it says that God hardened the hearts of the Egyptians so that they would not let the Hebrews go, so he could send the plagues on them. You know that song you used to hear, let my people go? Well, the Egyptians would have let them go. But God caused them not to, because God wanted to send the plagues on them. A man named Jacob is the son of Isaac and is Abraham's grandson. He's one of the main figures in the Old Testament. He's the one who cheated his brother Esau out of the firstborn son's blessing by disguising himself as his brother with the skin of a goat and tricked his old blind father into giving him the blessing. Then Jacob goes on in life, and frankly, if you'll read in the book of Genesis about Jacob, you'll see he's nothing but a con artist. That's all he is, a crook and a con artist. At the end of the book of Ezra, it has been determined that many of the men had married foreign wives. And this was considered not good. And so all the men are assembled. They are told they have violated God's command by marrying these foreign wives, and they must get rid of them. They also must get rid of the children they had with the foreign wives, and that's what they do. They just send them away. The women and the children. Get out. Get out! No indication they made any kind of provision for them. They just got rid of them. What kind of people do stuff like I could go on and on with example after example. The Old Testament is full of stuff like this. Most Christians gloss over it. And if you only use the Old Testament to read the Ten Commandments and 23rd Psalm, you can. But if you really start seriously reading the Old Testament, you'll see how much of this is in there. So let's think about some of the ways Christians have tried to deal with it. The first way is ignore it. Act like it's not in there. Just skip over those parts. Don't talk about it. Just say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And don't talk about the parts where God tells them to go kill the babies. That's how most Christians deal with it. Ignore it. Act like it's not there. Other Christians, though, say that the people God commanded to be killed were evil people, and they deserve to be killed. The Amaleks that we heard God talking about going in and kill the children of, they were evil. So they deserved to be killed. He needed killing. He deserved it. Other people say that since all people are sinners deserving the wrath of God, God is perfectly justified in ordering the killing of anybody he wants to. After all, if everybody's a filthy sinner and everybody deserves to burn in hell, then God's justified in killing you if he wants to. Other Christians take the position that God is God, which means that God makes the rules, so whatever God does is automatically justified. Whatever God does is okay, because by definition, whatever he does is moral. Now, none of those explanations seem reasonable to me. I can't ignore stuff like that. And frankly, none of those explanations deal with the real issue. You might use one of them to explain why God ordered people to be killed, but it doesn't explain things like Abraham and Isaac or law. Con artists like Jacob doesn't explain that stuff. So some Christians rightly reject any of those explanations, and they explain it all by saying that the Old Testament is just myth. None of that stuff really happened. God never said any of that stuff. These people never did any of that stuff. It's all just stories and myths. None of it's really true. It's just myth. And you know, that may seem to be a pretty good way to deal with it. You can get rid of it all like that, but there's a big problem like that. We've talked about this problem before. Once you start marking down things in the Bible as myth, there's nowhere to stop. Once you start saying this is a myth, you can go on through the whole Bible and say it's all a myth, and that's exactly what's been done. You mark down the whole Bible as myth, including Jesus. That's pretty much what's happened today. If you don't believe it, go to seminary and find out. So I don't think the answer is to mark all this stuff down as myths and stories that people made up. So now that we've rejected all the popular ways that people have to do that, what do we do? Do we just accept that God is amoral? That God is a mass murderer who delights in destruction and horror? Is that what God is like? Is that the view of God we get from Jesus? So how do we deal with this stuff? You know, this is, believe it or not, one of the main reasons why people are rejecting Christianity today. Is that stuff in the Old Testament. If you talk to people and ask them why, that's one of the main things they point to. Now, I can't tell you that I have the answer. I don't have the answer. This is about like the just war theory. It's something that you struggle with and struggle with and struggle with. But I want us to think about a few things. These are not really explanations. They're just thoughts, just things to consider. They're hopefully kernels for thinking that might lead us to something better down the road. There's 3 of them. And so here's the first. There's something very interesting that's mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. It's something that most people skip over, but it's in there 3 times. And I think it may speak to the issue we're talking about. The 3rd chapter of the book of Galatians is talking about the Old Testament law, and it says this: the law was added because of transgressions till the seed should come to whom the promise was made. And it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. Now the seed it's talking about is Jesus. But the really interesting thing there is it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. This indicates that the Old Testament law was given on behalf of angels through some kind of unidentified mediator, but yet the Old Testament itself pictures God himself as giving the law. There's no mention of angels giving the law or a mediator giving the law in the Old Testament, but that's what the book of Galatians says. If you go to the book of Acts, to chapter 7, it's speaking of Jews, and it says, they have received the law by the direction of angels and have not kept it. Here again is the idea that the Old Testament law was given by angels. But yet the Old Testament itself pictures the law as having been given directly by God. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 2, speaking of the Old Testament law, it says, for if the word spoken through angels proves steadfast, it refers to the law as the word spoken through angels. Again, here's this idea that the Old Testament law was given not by God himself, but by angels through some kind of unknown mediator. So where did this idea come from? We've seen 3 separate places in the New Testament that the Old Testament law was given by angels. We don't know. We don't know where it came from. We don't really know what that idea meant, the details about it. It survives in 3 snippets in the New Testament. It's obvious that during New Testament times there was an idea that the law was given through angels, and it was obviously a fairly widespread idea because we have it in 3 different New Testament books, 3 different authors. It's not just mentioned one time, it's mentioned 3 different times in 3 very different books. So what does that mean? We don't know. It's been lost to history. But I think we have to realize that having this idea 3 different places in the New Testament indicates that there was such a belief, and it must have been fairly widespread. You know, all we really know about Christianity in the early years, and all we really know about Jesus himself, is what's contained in the New Testament. And the New Testament only takes up about 1/8 of your Bible. That's all we have, really. There's so much we don't know. What was Christianity really like in those early years? We don't know. What exactly were the early beliefs of the Christians? We don't know. You know, the surviving material that we have about Christianity is stuff 200 and 300 and 400 years after the time of Jesus. Does that accurately reflect the beliefs 10 years after Jesus was on earth? We don't know. Did those first Christians have different beliefs than we know of? We don't know. You see, it's important to realize that the Christianity we inherited had its roots 300 years after the time of Jesus. Some of its roots, and its main roots, it had 1,500 years after the time of Jesus in the Protestant Reformation. The Christianity that we think has been around forever ain't been around but a few hundred years. And so we're so far removed from original Christianity that we'll never be able to know what original Christianity really was. But these New Testament passages about the law having been given by angels through a mediator should make us suspect that in the very least we're missing a very important part of the puzzle. And without that very important part of the puzzle, we're at an extreme disadvantage. All we can say is that there apparently were beliefs in ancient Christianity that have been lost. And they might change our understanding of everything, especially about the Old Testament, if we knew what they were. There's just so much we don't know. So that's one thing to consider. Now I want to look at something else. For our gospel reading, we heard Jesus tell the Jewish leaders, "You are of your father the devil. You are not of God." And I want you to stop and consider the implications of that. That comes from the mouth of Jesus himself. And Jesus is talking to the Jewish leaders, those at the very pinnacle of Judaism. And he tells them that not only do they not know God, but they are in fact of the devil. Think about that for a minute. Now, the way we've been told to deal with that is that the Jewish leaders must have been sort of like modern-day televangelists. They were in it for the money. They wore Rolex watches. They drove Rolls Royces. They had gold fixtures in their bathrooms. Isn't that the way we've been told to look at it? That they were hypocrites and cheats and crooks and just in it for the money? And that's why Jesus was criticizing them? Isn't that what we've always been told? Well, what if that's wrong? You know, that's actually just an assumption. There's nothing in the Bible to support that idea. People just came up with it. Why? Because that's what they had to come up with to maintain their opinion about why Jesus didn't like the Jewish leaders. It's what they had to decide. So that's what they say. Well, what if that's wrong? What if Jesus is not criticizing the Jewish leaders because they're like Jimmy Swaggart? You ever thought about that? In the Gospels, we hear Jesus say, "You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you." And then he goes on to directly contradict things from the Old Testament law. He does that several times. There's one other thing to consider. The oldest copies of the Old Testament we have are in Greek. It's called the Septuagint. And it dates from somewhere around 200 or so years before the time of Jesus. It was a version of the Old Testament in use at the time of Jesus. We know that because in the New Testament, when it quotes the Old Testament, that's the version it quotes. The Hebrew language copies of the Old Testament appeared about 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. But there's something very interesting about the Hebrew language version of the Old Testament. It has a number of different names for God. And they are Yahweh, or Jehovah, however you want to pronounce it. El Shaddai, El Elyon, Adonai, El Olam, Elohim, and Khan. Now, nobody really knows how the Hebrew version of the Old Testament was compiled. The assumption is that it was compiled over a number of years by looking at the Greek version and then looking at various other different versions of Scripture that Jews in different places were using their own language, whatever those different languages were, and then all this was somehow compiled together and translated over into the language of Hebrew, which they developed to put the Old Testament into. And so the assumption has been that all the different names for God were just different names that Jewish groups at different places had for God, but that they referred to the same thing. That is, they referred to God. But again, that's just an assumption, you see. And one of the things I hope I've emphasized in here is let's not go on assumption. It's possible that for at least some of these different names of God, they might actually refer to other divine entities. In other words, the possibility is that there were other divine entities active in the Old Testament, not just God. And a trace of that survives in these different names, which we assume are all talking about God, but they may not be. They might be talking about different entities active in the Old Testament. And that right there might go back to that idea that we saw in those 3 New Testament passages, that the law was given through angels by a mediator. Who knows? We don't want to make that assumption. I'm just saying it's something to consider. So we've got a big puzzle with what we do with the Old Testament. We've got 3 little pieces today of maybe a solution, but we really don't know what to do with them. We have these issues, and I'll admit this is disturbing. I just know that we see some awful disturbing things in that Old Testament, things that do not fit with the New Testament. And I think there are pieces of the puzzle to explain that have been lost. It's probably something this side of heaven will never be able to understand. As far as I'm concerned, I'm going to stick with Jesus in the picture of God we get from Him. I think there are, at this particular time in American Christianity within the past few months, there are too many Christians in the United States that have forgotten about Jesus and think only of the Old Testament. Let's not be one of those.